and welcome to MASH Reads, Magical Social Book Club. We are here with our pick for the month, Ken Lagunas, and his book, Trespassing Across America. Ken is here in the office to talk to us and to talk to all of you on Facebook about his book and his amazing adventure. He's got a really great presentation, and our climate weather science guy, Andrew, is going to be moderating. Please send us your questions online, and we will ask here. And definitely follow us on Twitter at MashReads for everybody's live tweets, and you can also post your questions there. Thank you. Andrew, you're all good.
Cool. Well, welcome. I really enjoyed this book, and that's as a reporter who has been covering Keystone for way too long. This is just an entirely fresh way of looking at the whole thing, and it's a much more human way and a much more fulfilling way than a lot of the political fight stories that we've covered. And the science and climate, which is more depressing. So I'll let you get to your presentation first, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then open it up to the folks here and elsewhere, I guess.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So I recently finished a 15-city book tour, and I put together a small 15-20-minute presentation, which I'll give to you guys. Before I started, I spoke to an author friend and asked for advice on how to do a book reading, and he said the worst part about a book reading is the actual book reading. So I won't do that. I'll read maybe a passage or two, but yeah, let me just tell you a yarn about my story. So I decided to go on a walk across America following a controversial oil pipeline, and I had a few questions on my mind. Questions like, has climate change in fact put our planet on an irreversible path to destruction? If so, what is our duty as individuals up against something so enormous? How far should each of us go to protect our planet? But the question that was on my mind more than anything was, what should I do about the cows? So I was about to set out on a never-before-done and sort of illegal 1,700-mile hike across the heartland, following the Keystone XL pipeline, which was stretched from Alberta, Canada, down to the Gulf Coast of Texas. And pipelines, they don't like roads. They don't like to follow roads. Pipelines like to get to their market or refinery in as few miles as possible. So that means they want to cross croplands and grasslands and private property. So that meant if I wanted to hike the Keystone XL, I essentially have to do the same. This would mean that I'd have to walk across Alberta Prairie and Saskatchewan pasture and Montana hills and South Dakota canyons, Nebraska cornfields, and then down through Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Which means that to hike the Keystone XL, I'd essentially have to trespass across America. And this also meant that I'd have to walk past thousands and thousands of cows. And, you know, being a suburbanite from New York who's never been near a cow or touched a cow or milked a cow, and who knew nothing about cows except that they were bigger than me and faster than me and had horns and were bullfighters and chased people through Spain, yeah, I was a little nervous. So let me tell you a little bit about how I got the idea. It was actually my buddy Liam. We were working up in Dead Horse, Alaska, way up there in the Prudhoe Bay oil fields. Possibly the most miserable place on earth. It was an oilman's camp. It's not like a real town. There's like no children. There's no schools. There's none of your basic cultural and social institutions. It's just a lot of equipment and a lot of dudes. This is what it looks like. And like, I mean, there's like a 9-to-1 male to female ratio up here. And you know, if any females are thinking, you know, I can go up to Alaska and have options. We have a saying up in Alaska, and that's the odds are good, but the goods are odd. So I'm 28 and I'm broke and I'm washing dishes for a living. And when you're 28 and broke and washing spoon after spoon in the middle of the night in a silent kitchen, 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle in an Arctic labor camp, you begin to question the direction your life is headed in. But I can say this also from experience, and that's the soul must be caged before it can be set free. So when Liam, the cook next to me, suggested we hike the Keystone XL, which was in the news all the time back in 2011, I must have just looked at him with this frightening excitement and said, we must. So after that, kind of things started to look up for me. I hitchhiked at a dead horse. I got a book deal for Walden on Wheels, which was my first book. I had money in the bank for the first time, and things were going well for me, but I wanted to consciously hold on to that flash of inspiration. I didn't want to forget it. And when Liam suggested we hike the Keystone. So let me just read a quick passage. Liam and I had stayed in touch all that time to discuss trip logistics. At first, the expedition, along with most of my other ideas, could have been listed under the category of things I fantasize about doing, and probably won't, but are fun to think about doing anyway. We had monthly phone conversations about the trip. It was clear that I was far more excited about the expedition than he was, but by the end of each conversation, he seemed to be re-energized and rededicated. I'd begun to wonder, though, if Liam had the frame of mind necessary to commit to such a long journey. For one thing, he began to question if it would be better to wait another year so we could properly prepare and save up enough money. More unsettling was the suggestion that we don't have to do the whole thing, and that we could hike for a bit, take some months off, and start again whenever we wanted to. Such suggestions were hardly unreasonable, but I'd read enough books on real-life journeys to appreciate how reasonableness isn't always a good trait for someone who's about to do something ultimately unreasonable. Still, I so wanted Liam to come. I knew that he'd be the perfect traveling companion. He was kind, intelligent, a great cook. I pictured the two of us trudging across the lonely, wide-open prairie, like Sam and Frodo on a long, perilous journey. We'd take care of each other, lift each other up when we were down, and perhaps, like the hobbits in moments of utter hopelessness, hold hands in that tender, brotherly, pre-20th century and not quite gay way. I imagined us on a journey of high adventure, escaping gunfire, taking cover from tornadoes, and maybe whispering in a moment of life or death suspense with a hushed tone of poised determination, run. So I started preparing. I bought a whole bunch of food. I've learned a thing or two about nutrition in the past few years. But you want to get stuff that's going to keep and that stuff that's calorie dense. So I had like a whole bunch of energy bars and powdered whole milk and granola and stuff like that. Here I am mixing up a box of trail mix. And I'm boxing up all this food. So my buddy in Denver, he's going to mail these boxes to post offices along my route. And this is how folks doing hikes on the Appalachian Trail and Pacific Crest Trail do it. They usually pack up all this stuff beforehand. I buy a mapping software program called Topo by National Geographic, and with some government maps of the Keystone XL, I'm able to chart it on this mapping system and then print out just 75 beautiful maps. And so I'd be walking with a compass in one hand and a map in the other. I could have brought a GPS, but I just wanted to learn how to navigate better. Just lots of little stuff. Is there a flasher here?
There's a laser pointer on the top.
Oh, there we go. You can't see it on the TV. Well, anyways, this is a portable solar charger, this black thing that comes around. Then on the bottom here is some chlorine dioxide. This is how I would purify my water. Up top left is a med kit, then a compass, and that red canister, that's bear spray, and a jackknife on the right, which I use for protection if I needed it. I buy something called a tarp tent. This is super light. It's held up by my trekking poles. And the whole thing just weighs 1.5 pounds because when you're going to go on a long journey across America, you want to go as light as possible because you can feel every single ounce. And this was back in 2012, just when the iPad 3 came out, so I bought one of those, and this was just critical because I wanted to blog about my journey, I wanted to share it, and I could do so much with this thing. I could edit my photos on there, I could edit my videos, I could catch up on emails, I had a Kindle app, so I had books every single night I could read in the tent. And here I am, ready to go. I have about 45 pounds packed. Just one glitch in the planning process was that Liam remembered that he was banned from Canada because of an undisclosed offense he committed in his wayward youth. So this meant that I'd have to go alone. But before I started my hike, there was something I wanted to see. I wanted to see the tar sands of northern Alberta. I'm sure you guys have heard of it, maybe recently with the forest fires going on up there in Fort McMurray being kind of taken over. And this is where the oil that would be pumped down the Keystone XL, this is where it would be coming from. So let me tell you first a little bit about the Keystone XL just to refresh your memory. So it starts up in Hardisty, Alberta, and then it's this yellow dash line. It pumps all the way down to Steel City, Nebraska, and then it goes into a pre-existing pipeline called the Keystone 1, which is in the ground, comes out in Cushing, Oklahoma, and then a second part of the XL would be built from Cushing to Port Arthur, Texas. Once it gets to Port Arthur, this oil is refined and either moved to domestic markets or shipped to foreign markets overseas. So just to update you on the political situation, the northern part of the Keystone XL, that top part of the yellow dash, that was rejected in 2015 by President Obama. The lower section was approved, and as I was walking in 2012 and 2013, that was being laid in the ground. And this orange one, the Keystone 1, that is in the ground. That was in the ground since about 2010. That's called the Keystone 1, and just a few months ago, there was a spill there in South Dakota, which you guys may have heard of. So what is the pipe? It's 36 inches in diameter. It would be buried entirely beneath the ground, as most pipelines are. And what would be transported through it? It's something called dilbit, or diluted bitumen. This is bitumen right here, yet to be diluted, and this is coming from the ground in northern Alberta. And this section here is vast. This is 54,000 square mile area. And to get this oil, you need to essentially bulldoze the boreal forest up there and then dig tens of feet into the ground, scooping out this bitumen material, which is a mixture of sand, water, clay, and oil. And on site, it's sort of refined. It's essentially boiled and then mixed with a whole bunch of chemicals, some very hazardous, like benzene, and then it becomes diluted bitumen, or dilbit, which flows through these tar sands pipelines. So on a brisk September morning in 2012, I don't know how I'm going to get up to Canada to start this journey, so I take a bus as far north as I can to Fort Collins, Colorado, and stick out my thumb and begin to hitchhike the rest of the way, about 1,000 miles to Fort McMurray. And you can't see the tar sands from ground level, you have to be above them. So I buy a $200 flight over the tar sands, and I'm flying over this area. This is the boreal forest, spruce trees, birch trees. It's beautiful and lush, it smells like autumn. And I begin to pass over this enormous tailings pond. And this is where they're dumping all of that residue from that first refining process in these man-made ponds, which are actually lakes. And the strange thing about these is they have scarecrows on some in hazmat suits, because when the ducks land on them, the ducks die, and they have these eerie looking like orange scarecrows that they've dubbed bitumen. It's a crazy place out there. And I'm passing over these just weird soccer ball size fields of blackness. This is a pet coke, or petroleum coke. This is left over from the refining process, and this can be used as a secondary fossil fuel, and it is it's nastier stuff, even nastier than coal. And then I fly over these weird yellow sulfur pyramids. They don't know what to do with the sulfur coming from the refining process, so they're building these weird yellow pyramids up into the sky. And I'm flying, and from pretty much one edge of the earth to the next, this is what I'm seeing. Just this enormous mud pit where they're digging into the ground. You know, maybe a decade or 2 decades ago, this was all boreal forest. And I get off the plane and I say to the pilot, like, wow, that was just huge. That was amazing. And he says what we saw was just 10% of the pit mining operation. And pit mining only accounts for 50% of the extraction methods to get tar sands out of the ground. So what's going on in northern Alberta right now could be the worst man-made environmental disaster in world history. You might be wondering like why I'm so obsessed with the tar sands and why I'm going so far to see them, and I think it's probably because I'm from Niagara Falls, New York. Just 4 miles from my boyhood home is this place called Love Canal. You may have heard of it. One of the sites of one of the most tragic environmental disasters in U.S. history. In the 1940s, this chemical company, Hooker Chemical Company, buried a whole bunch of toxic waste beneath the ground. And decades later, in the 70s, families began experiencing unprecedented levels of cancer, epilepsy, miscarriages. Children were being born with second rows of teeth. So growing up next to Love Canal just kind of reminded me, which is a ghost town right now, it just kind of reminded me like what happens when industry gets to have its way. And when I heard about what was happening in the tar sands, where they're bulldozing these millions of acres of boreal forest and polluting the pristine rivers, and where the native families there are experiencing unprecedented levels of cancer, you know, I didn't think of this as some exotic, faraway place. I just thought of it as a home, you know, someone else's home that's being destroyed the same way my hometown had been. So the hike, this is the sort of land I'm walking across. This is the Great Plains. This is the prairie. There's not many trees out there. And the goal is to get south as fast as possible because I'm starting this trip in late September in Canada, and I'm worried about getting like nailed by winter in Montana or something. So I figured, you know, I could do like 20 miles a day, 100 days, get this thing done with. But by day 7, my feet were a mess, and I ran out of moleskin, which is good for blisters. So I started duct taping my feet. It didn't do anything. Don't do this. It just makes your feet look ridiculous.
Did you have shoes on?
Oh yeah, of course. I had
No, because in that one shot, you talked about your backpack,
Yeah.
the whole 45 pounds of it, and you were barefoot. And then you showed us.
Yeah, that was just in my buddy's face.
Just saying, I thought, well, you know.
I was bright enough.
see some light.
So I have like 8, by the first week I have 8 blisters on my feet. I have gashes on my ankles. I have athlete's feet. And a couple weeks later I get this horrible shin splint injury. Has anyone had a shin splint injury? Oh, they're just awful. Like I could not walk to the bathroom in comfort, let alone across a continent. And I thought at one point that I just wasn't going to be able to do it. And I'm walking in like a constant state of fear because I am trespassing across people's property. I'm worried about upsetting landowners. I'm worried about winter coming, and I'm worried about all these cows. And I remember like, earlier in Montana, I was hitchhiking, and I got picked up by this rancher. Her name was Doris. I'm like, Doris, what do I do if a cow comes charging at me? And she says, just look them in the eye and talk to them manly. And when she observed that I was not the sort of person to look them in the eye or talk to them manly, she said, when they charge, just step to the side of them, tire them out like that. Not what you want to hear. But I'm starting to figure stuff out. Like I'm navigating with my map and my compass, and I begin to just kind of recognize all the stuff that I would normally never recognize on a drive-through, like little signs where the pipeline is, and for the first couple hundred miles, I would be walking this pipeline that parallels another pipeline. So I knew I'd be on my right path if I stayed on these other pipeline paths. And you can't tell when a pipeline is in the ground, buried under the grass. But you can see these signs like this, and you know like those red balls that are in like telephone and electrical wires on the road? That usually indicates where there's a pipeline going beneath the ground. So on the treeless prairie, I could see, you know, a mile, 2 miles ahead, one of these red balls, and I knew if I just kept walking towards that, I'd remain on my nice, tight, southeasterly course. I'm camping out in people's yards, and I'm trying to do so in the most concealed way possible. And sometimes this is as many trees as I could find. I mean, there are not trees out there on this part of the Great Plains. Other times, the wind just blows so hard because there's nothing to stop it, no trees, no hills. So I would just sometimes find like a shack like this and set up my tent behind it as a kind of a wind barrier. One time I got nailed by a blizzard, and I just stayed in this abandoned barn in South Dakota. And the cows, like, they weren't so bad, surprisingly. Like, I would have to deal with this several times a day, where I would have to hop a barbed wire fence. I would hop like 50 barbed wire fences in a day and walk up to her. Not normally clustered like this. They were usually kind of spread out. But you can imagine why it was a little scary. I mean, they are big animals. You're walking through tens of thousands of them. You know, what if one of them's having a bad day? But they would always react the same way. They'd always be kind of just munching on the grass, and then one would hear me, you know, walking towards them, and it would just swing its head up, and it would have, you know, it would stop chewing, so it would have like a bunch of like grass sticking out of the side of its mouth, and then all 80 cows would be just staring at me as I'm walking towards them. One of them gets freaked out and runs away, and then all 80 of them freak out and run away. And you know, you're just like 170 pounds scaring off like 80,000. You just feel powerful.
Yeah, these are all females.
No, there's bulls and...
Okay,
yeah.
because you said cows.
Yeah, bulls, cows, yeah.
Because I was looking for udders, you know, and I saw something that didn't resemble an udder.
For water, I would drink what the cows drank. I would drink out of ponds and lakes. I didn't know what these things even were. I just thought they were like decoration out there. Yeah, these are called windmill springs. Wind blows, they pump up water from the ground into a trough where the cows drink out of, and that's where I get a lot of my water. I usually mix my chlorine dioxide treatment with it. And when there was no water sources, this is when I'd go knocking on doors. This was my opportunity to talk with folks about the Keystone XL and pipelines and climate change. And this guy, his name's Carl in Alberta, and he looked to his backyard and pointed to the Keystone 1 pipeline, which was going through his property, and he says, that's the best thing that's ever happened to me. He says he got generously compensated, $10,000, $20,000. The pipe had yet to leak. And this was the general impression I got from Canadians in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Their pipelines and oil, that's a huge part of the provincial economy. That's where they're getting a lot of their tax money. And pipelines have just been in that culture for a long time, so it's very normal. Once I crossed the border into the US, I kind of got a slightly different reaction. There was still a lot of indifference, but there was more people opposed to it on the grounds of private property rights. You know, people, a rancher didn't want some foreign corporation laying a pipe in land that his great-granddaddy had homesteaded 100 plus years ago. Nebraska really stuck out because they were opposed to it almost on a statewide level. And that's because the Ogallala Aquifer underlies pretty much the whole state. That's where about 80% of the state gets its drinking water. That's how they irrigate their crops. So they were worried about the pipe rupturing and then contaminating all this important groundwater. So you saw a lot of opposition in Nebraska, and this guy, his name's Rick, he was a farmer rancher, and he was not happy about the Keystone XL, which was set to go through his family's property. And he decided to join me for 3 or 4 days. And I kind of pictured myself as like that Forrest Gump, where you have a whole bunch of people following you. It only ended up to be Rick, and just for 3 or 4 days. But it was working. He wanted to drum up as much negative publicity as he could for Trans-Canada, and every single day we were being interviewed by local TV, local newspapers. Over the course of this trip, I was interviewed by New York Times, Mother Jones, NPR, Huffington Post, and I wasn't lighting the internet on fire in any way, but in some small way it was working. Like I was furthering the conversation about the Keystone XL through this crazy thing that I was doing. And when I walked into the U.S., like I no longer felt like a stranger on the prairie. I felt accustomed to the chatter of coyotes outside of my tent each night, or I'd be walking across the prairie and I'd see like 50 deer or 50 pronghorn just storming across the grass and elegantly leaping over these barbed wire fences. And I remember once I was walking across this hayfield and like 5,000 ducks ascended into the sky and began to kind of just revolve like a twister about to set down. And the clouds, I mean, they're just like moving mountain chains sailing across this deep blue sky. The plain sky is just enormous without anything to obstruct it. And even though it's in the center of one of the busiest, loudest, most populous countries on earth, the Great Plains may be one of those last places we can go to in this country to just feel utterly alone. And I mean that in a really magnificent way. Like out there, you are just like this solitary skiff on this ocean of grass. I'd often think about when I was a dishwasher a few years before, and when I had that crazy idea, that flash of inspiration. I think we all know what it's like to get that crazy idea in our chest. Maybe it's not about going on like a long walk. Maybe it's about starting a business or writing a novel or something. And I don't know. I think we have those moments, those flashes of inspiration for good reason. Because I remember when I was out here, I never felt like so at peace with myself. Every other day of my life, I'm in some like existential crisis mode. Like, do I need a girlfriend? Should I go to nursing school? Should I be living here? Like when I was out on this trip for 4.5 months, I was so at peace with the present. I knew I was exactly where I needed to be at that moment in time. So I think we have those flashes of inspiration for good reason. Maybe they represent some aching existential need that's gone unfulfilled. And I've learned to kind of hold on to them and follow through with them, because you can't go wrong following through with something that some inner part of you is clamoring for. And I've learned not to think of those crazy ideas as crazy ideas, but as messages from fate calling upon you to do something grand. So let me finish with one last really quick passage. So I'm about halfway through. I'm in South Dakota. The prairie was as desolate as ever. I couldn't see any homes, and I crossed a rarely traveled gravel road every few miles. I hopped a barbed wire fence into a cow pasture and casually walked up to a herd of black Angus cows. These cows, I observed, weren't running away from me as they normally would. I yelled, "Get out of here, cows," and waved my poles in the air, trying to freak them out, but they only moved a few yards to the left and right, creating a narrow corridor, which I had no choice but to walk through. The land was flat, except for a gentle downward slope that led to a creek that had dried up. I walked down the slope, and in the grassy creek bed there was another dozen cows staring at me. The cows that I had just passed had gathered and were following me down the hill. I had moving cows behind me and motionless cows in front of me. My heart thumped. My pulse raced. I became unseasonably sweaty. I had just taken a hit of adrenaline. All the pains and sores that I had been walking with were completely forgotten, and I now had one and only one aim: get away from these cows. I was surrounded, and then I heard it. I looked back for a moment, one blip of a second, and caught a glimpse of the most terrifying, amazing, makes my leg wobbly thing I'd ever set my eyes on. It was a tidal wave of black muscle pouring down the hill, a horde of black Angus cows just 10 yards behind me, their hooves launching tufts of grass into the air, their huge bodies moving across the treeless prairie in a thunderous, ground-shaking roar. The worst of my fears had come true. I was being attacked by cows. There was only one word on my mind, which communicated itself to me in a not-so-hushed tone of not-so-poised determination. Run. Thank you.
Thank you for that. One of the funniest characters in this book that you met, in my mind, was the governor. In terms of his story in sort of accidentally portraying the governor of Nebraska on the trip to Russia. But I think the overall lesson of your journey really, for me, was like how one can find one's purpose by being in the present, and how much kindness you actually encountered, even though like you might have had very specific views on this pipeline, but your openness in talking to people, in getting their views and what it meant to them, and to some people in Canada, it was just a job or someone else's job. To some people in Nebraska, it was a very existential threat to the aquifer that sustains them and much of the plain states. To reporters like me at the time, like in BC and Chicago and New York, like it was a political fight, you know, that was somewhat esoteric but growing more and more central every day. And now, like, how do you view Keystone now? You know, Obama has rejected it. There'll be this challenge in the TPP agreement and weird stuff, but let's just say it's dead. And you have every other pipeline now being challenged. How do you feel about like this journey in the context of environmentalism? Because in the book you talk about this sort of akin to the Hetchy fight in 1906.
That's right, yeah. And I think you have a great point that this pipeline was a lot of different things to a lot of different people. You know, in Canada, it was a job. In Montana, maybe a slight nuisance. In Nebraska, you know, it was affecting, you know, it might affect their livelihood. And to the rest of the country, it was a climate change battle. I think the people fighting this pipeline on the Great Plains, they thought of it more of like a local environment thing, when, you know, we on the west and east coast thought of this more as a climate change battle. So yeah, it was interesting how people came at it from different angles. But yeah, I think the Keystone XL will be remembered as kind of a watershed moment in U.S. environment history. We were just talking earlier on the podcast, like we've been building oil pipelines since the 1860s. The first was a wooden gutter in West Virginia. As we speak, there's 1.7 million miles of oil and gas pipelines in the U.S. Why are we making such a big deal over this 1,700-mile pipeline in a country crisscrossed by pipelines? And I think it's for a number of reasons. I think we just kind of got to a point where we're just like, no more. Like this was just a line drawn in the sand, and we were led by a very strong climate movement coalition. They just kind of made it their prerogative and jumped on with these local groups like Bold, Nebraska, that was fighting for it. And a pipeline, and this particular pipeline, because it crosses an international border, it needed presidential approval. So let's say like we want to end the coal industry, like how difficult is that going to be? You know, that is like legislatively impossible. Whereas with the Keystone XL, all you have to do is convince one person, and that's President Obama. So this was a fight you could possibly win. It was a fight you could rally people around. And now, because of not just fight over the Keystone XL, and not just the rejection, but just the fight, we see pipelines all across the country that are being opposed and defeated. The Bluegrass Pipeline in Kentucky, the Northeast Energy Direct that would go from New York into New England, the Northern Gateway in British Columbia. This stuff was not happening 5, 6, 7 years ago. You know, how many of us remember the fight over the Keystone 1 pipeline, which was built in 2010? There was no fight, but yet a year later, you got a whole bunch of people raising a big stink about a pipeline. So yeah, this is, I think, the beginning of the death of pipelines, and we're now questioning what was an ordinary conveyance of energy for the first time.
Yeah, and I think it's not just pipelines, it's
So that was author Ken Ogunas talking about Trespassing America. We are just about to sign off, but everyone go check out that book. It's such an incredible book about one man's amazing journey walking across the country. And so till next time, you can catch us on Twitter and Facebook, where you're watching now, with the hashtag #MashRead. So thank you for joining us. Bye, everyone.